Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading a new book called Cheaper by the Dozen. Now, the first thing we do when we have a new book is we preview it. And the first thing we look at is the cover. And the cover tells us a lot. The cover tells us that this is probably a picture, and the book probably takes place between the late 19 teens and the 1920s. And the reason I say that is because here you see men in top hats, and then look at this car and the type of car it is. So that tells us a lot, and that gets our brain ready for hearing or reading something new. The other thing, of course, is look at this car and all the children in the car and all the people in the car. And here's a picture of the dad and the mom. And so we are beginning to get an idea of why it's called Cheaper by the Dozen. If you open the book and read the table of contents, the names of the chapters, that'll also give you some ideas. Whistles and shaving brushes, Pierce Arrow, orphans in uniform. And then there's the foreword, and the foreword in this case is very interesting because it tells you about the parents. Mother and dad, Lillian Moeller Gilbreth and Frank Bunker Gilbreth, were industrial engineers. They were among the first in the scientific management field and the very first in motion study. From 1910 to 1924, which is the time period I thought from looking at the picture, their firm of Gilbreth Incorporated was employed as efficiency experts by many of the major industrial plants in the United States, Britain, and Germany. Dad died in 1924. After that, Mother carried the load by herself and became perhaps the foremost woman industrial engineer. But that's another story. This book is about the Gilbreth family before Dad died. And if we look at the back of the book, we find things like one of the best-loved American memoirs of an oversized family and the parents who held them together. A memoir is a little bit like an autobiography. The authors of the book, Frank Gilbreth and Ernestine Gilbreth Carey, are brother and sister, so they are two of the children that's in the back of this car, and they are telling about their life when they were children. And that's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. A memoir is going to be a segment of life, or it's going to have a theme, but it's not going to be telling about somebody's life from the day they were born until much later in life. An autobiography is more detailed with facts, whereas a memoir has a lot of feelings and thoughts and impressions. And frankly, if you ask the other 10 siblings, there may be things that they don't agree with that these two siblings have written about, because different people react to different incidents in different ways. Now we begin with chapter 1, Whistles and Shaving Bristles. Dad was a tall man with a large head, jowls, and a Herbert Hoover collar. He was no longer slim. He had passed the 200-pound mark during his early 30s and left it so far behind that there were times when he had to resort to railway baggage scales to ascertain his displacement, in other words, his weight. Back then, at that particular time period, a sign that a man was successful and wealthy is he was overweight. And I'm going to show you a picture of my great-grandfather, who was considered well-to-do, and I'm assuming that this car is a Pierce Arrow, and he also drove a Pierce Arrow. But you can see he's a very large man, and he probably weighed 300 pounds, as did his brothers, who were also very successful. They were all very large, and that was a sign that you were successful. My other great-grandfather was tall and very thin. He was not considered successful. He was a farmer. So there's that. Okay, moving on with the rest of the book. No more side stories. But he carried himself with the self-assurance of a successful gentleman who was proud of his wife, proud of his family, and proud of his business accomplishments. Dad had enough gall to be divided into 3 parts, and the ability and poise to backstop the front he placed before the world. He walked into a factory like the Zeiss factory in Germany or the Pierce Arrow plant in this country and announced that he could speed up production by 1/4, and he'd do it too. One reason he had so many children, there were 12 of us, was that he was convinced anything he and Mother teamed up on was sure to be a success. Dad always practiced what he preached, and it was just about impossible to tell where his scientific management company ended and his family life began. His office was full of children, and he often took 2 or 3 of us, and sometimes all 12, on business trips. Frequently, we'd tag along at his side, pencils and notebooks in our hands, when Dad toured a factory which had hired him as an efficiency expert. On the other hand, our house at Montclair, New Jersey, was a sort of school for scientific management and the elimination of wasted motion, or motion study, as Dad and Mother named it. Dad took moving pictures of us children washing dishes so he could figure out how we could reduce our motions and thus hurry through the task. Irregular jobs such as painting the back porch or removing a stump from the front lawn were awarded on low bid basis. Each child who wanted to earn extra pocket money submitted a sealed bid saying what he would do the job for. The lowest bidder got the contract. Dad installed process and work charts in the bathrooms. Every child old enough to write, and Dad expected his offspring to start writing at a tender age, was required to initial the charts in the morning after he'd brushed his teeth, taken a bath, combed his hair, and made his bed. At night, each child had to weigh himself, plot the figure on a graph, initial the process charts again after he'd done his homework, washed his hands and face, and brushed his teeth. Mother wanted to have a place on the charts for saying prayers, but Dad said as far as he was concerned, prayers were voluntary. It was regimentation, all right, but bear in mind the trouble most parents have in getting one child off to school, and now multiply it by 12. Some regimentation was necessary to prevent bedlam. Of course, there were times when a child would initial the charts without actually having fulfilled the requirements. However, Dad had a gimlet eye and a terrible swift sword. The combined effort was that truth usually went marching on. Yes, at home or on the job, Dad was always the efficiency expert. He buttoned his vest from bottom up instead of from the top down because the bottom to top process took him only 3 seconds, while the top to bottom took 7. He even used 2 shaving brushes to lather his face because he found that by doing so, he could cut 17 seconds off his shaving time. For a while, he tried shaving with 2 razors, but he finally gave that up. "I can save 44 seconds, he grumbled, but I wasted 2 minutes this morning putting bandages on my throat." It wasn't the slashed throat that really bothered him, it was those 2 minutes. Some people used to say that Dad had so many children he couldn't keep track of them. Dad himself used to tell a story about one time when Mother went off to fill a lecture engagement and left him in charge at home. When Mother returned, she asked him if everything had run smoothly. "Didn't have any trouble, except with that one over there," he replied. But a spanking brought him in line. Mother could handle any crisis without losing her composure. That's not one of ours, dear," she said. "He belongs next door." None of us remembers it, and maybe it never happened. Dad wasn't above stretching the truth because there was nothing he liked better than a joke, particularly if it was on him, and even more particularly if it were on Mother. This much is certain, though. There were 2 redheaded children who lived next door, and the Gilbreths all were blondes and redheads. Although he was a strict taskmaster within his home, Dad tolerated no criticism of the family from outsiders. Once a neighbor complained that a Gilbreth had called the neighbor's boy a son of an unprinted word. "What are the facts of the matter?" Dad asked blandly, and then walked away while the neighbor registered a double take. But Dad hated unprintable words, and the fact that he had stood up for his son didn't prevent him from holding a full-dress court of inquiry once he got home and administering the call for punishment. Dad was happiest in a crowd, especially a crowd of kids. Wherever he was, you'd see a string of them trailing him, and the ones with plenty of freckles were pretty sure to be Gilbreths. He had a way with children and knew how to keep them on their toes. He had a respect for them too, and didn't mind showing it. He believed that most adults stopped thinking the day they left school, and some even before that. A child, on the other hand, says impressionable and eager to learn. Catch one young enough, Dad insisted, and there's no limit to what you can teach them. Really, it was love of children more than anything else that made him want a pack of his own. Even with a dozen, he wasn't fully satisfied. Sometimes he'd look over at us and say to Mother, "Never you mind, Lily, you did the best you could." We children used to suspect, though, that one reason he had wanted a large family was to assure himself of an appreciative audience, even within the confines of his home. With us around, he could always be sure of a full house, packed to the galleries. Whenever Dad returned from a trip, even if he had been gone only a day, he whistled the family assembly call. As he turned in at the sidewalk of our large brown home in Montclair, the call was a tune he had composed. He whistled it loud and shrill by doubling his tongue between his front teeth. It took considerable effort, and Dad, who never exercised if he could help it, usually ended up puffing with exhaustion. The call was important, though. It meant drop everything and come running or risk dire consequences. I am going to pause here. If you've ever seen The Sound of Music, when the father gets his whistle out and he blows the whistle and all the children come running and stand at attention, that's what this reminds me of. At the first note, Gilbreth children came dashing from all corners of the house and yard. Neighborhood dogs, barking hellishly, converged for blocks around. Heads popped out of windows of nearby houses. Dad gave the whistle often. He gave it when he had an important family announcement that he wanted to be sure everyone would hear. He gave it when he was bored and wanted some excitement with his children. He gave it when he had invited a friend home and wanted both to introduce the friend to the whole family and to show the friend how quickly the family could assemble. On such occasions, Dad would click a stopwatch, which he always carried in his vest pocket. Like most of Dad's ideas, the assembly call, while something more than a nuisance, made sense. This was demonstrated in particular one day when a bonfire of leaves in the driveway got out of control and spread to the side of the house. Dad whistled and the house was evacuated in 14 seconds, 8 seconds off the all-time record. That occasion also was remarkable because of the remarks from a frank neighbor who watched the blaze from his yard. During the height of the excitement, the neighbor's wife came to the front door and called to her husband, "What's going on?" "Oh, the Gilbreth's house is on fire," he replied. "Thank God." "Shall I call the fire department?" she shouted. "What's the matter? Are you crazy?" the husband answered incredulously. Anyway, the fire was put out quickly, and there was no need to ask the fire department for help. Dad whistled assembly when he wanted to find out who'd been using his razors or who had spilled ink on his desk. He whistled it when he had special jobs to assign or errands to run. Mostly, though, he sounded the assembly call when he was about to distribute some wonderful surprises, with the biggest and best going to the one who reached him first. So when we heard him whistle, we never knew whether to expect good news or bad, rags or riches, but we did know for sure we'd better get there in a hurry. Sometimes as we all came running to the front door, he'd start by being stern. "Let me see your nails, all of you," he'd grunt with his face screwed up in a terrible frown. "Are they clean? Have you been biting them? Do they need trimming?" Then out would come leather manicure sets for the girls, pocket knives for the boys. How we loved them. When his frown wrinkles reversed their field and became a wide grin. Or he'd shake hands solemnly all around, and when you took your hand away, there'd be a nut chocolate bar in it. Or he'd ask who had a pencil, and then hand out a dozen automatic ones. "Let's see what time it is," he asked once. Out came wristwatches for all, even the 6-week-old baby. "Oh, Daddy, they're just right," we'd say. And when we'd throw our arms around him and tell him how we'd missed him, he would choke up and wouldn't be able to answer. So he'd rumple our hair and slap our bottoms instead. Well, this is going to be a fun book, and we're going to learn a lot about being efficient and a lot about the era between 1910 and into the early 1920s. Bye-bye.